is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. Today, we are stoked, no joke, because we got a special guest. Today, we are going to be talking to Michael Monaco, the author of The Highest Level of All, the story of fantasy wargaming. Michael, how you doing today?
Oh, pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Feels like forever ago that we did the original episode on fantasy wargaming. And then we kind of connected after that because I got some stuff wrong.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're mostly right. I mean, there just wasn't much information out there, but I happen to know some of the answers that you're wondering about.
I love the idea that there is like a scholar specializing in fantasy wargaming. Like it seems to be like such like, and it's sort of a beautifully odd and idiosyncratic game in a lot of ways. So I think that it merits the attention, but I feel like I was surprised and gladdened to know that there was somebody working on unearthing all the nooks and crannies of the game's development and history. And it's turned into a book now.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Well, to me, at least, I mean, and hopefully, to your listeners too, because it's one of those games that I think almost everybody who was around, who was like into gaming, maybe in the 80s, had seen it at some point, or, at least seen it in the magazines because it was in the science fiction book club and stuff like that, or at the mall, which is where I found it. Me and my brother, were preteens probably at the Deptford Mall in New Jersey. And we found, we found the book and read it. And like a lot of people were a little confused by it, but we actually did end up playing it a little bit, which not everyone went that far, and a lot of people since then, have had a lot to say about it just because it is so idiosyncratic and, there's a lot of sensational or easily sensationalized things to it. It's probably the first book to have a picture of the devil's penis on the cover. It's probably the first role-playing book to stat out God and the Virgin Mary and all the saints. And
possibly the only one.
Possibly, yeah, probably.
It had sort of a surprising reach for a book that idiosyncratic. Was it just how did that happen? How did they convince so many different versions of this thing to come out? And it was a UK book. It got US distribution, which is like unheard of at the time.
Yeah. From what I've been able to figure out. So it started in the UK, and one of the contributors was Bruce Quarry, Quarry, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, who was kind of a big name in wargaming. And he had written a bunch of introductory level books on wargaming in different eras. So he had, the Patrick Stevens Limited Guide to Ancient Wargaming, then the Guide to Napoleonic Wargaming, World War II Wargaming, etc. And he worked for Patrick Stevens Limited, which was, kind of a specialty publisher that did a lot of military history and also, a lot of stuff about war games. So I think probably he was their in to get their idea published. And because Patrick Stevens Limited was, relatively mainstream, they went for an American distributor, and they found Stein & Day, which is a very literary publisher, really. They mostly were doing stuff with, kind of serious, novelists and things like that. So the son of Saul Stein, David Stein, was very into Dungeons and Dragons. And when they got the manuscript, and the offer, he said, yeah, we should go for it, I guess. And they actually put his son, who was, I don't know, in his late teens, early 20s, in charge of producing the American version. So he went through and Americanized, all the spellings and stuff like that. He added the index, which was pretty helpful.
Love an index.
Yeah.
He also gave it the infamous byline, The Highest Level of All, which a lot of people look at the book and think that's the title, The Highest Level of All Fantasy Wargaming, because it's so prominent right over the title.
It certainly adds a sense of swagger. I don't know if I appreciate it or I find it off-putting, which is sort of the charm, I guess.
I mean, for me, man, talk about a hell of a summer job. I got carts to the A&P in the heat. Much better gig this kid had.
Right?
So from there, I guess Doubleday picked it up for the Book of the Month Club. And, that made it even more widely distributed. So yeah, so I think there's probably one or two games by Avalon Hill that made it into bookstores, before Fantasy Wargaming, but really apart from the Dungeons and Dragons, nothing else, from the whole role-playing niche, had this kind of mainstream distribution.
But it didn't really pay off.
Well, yeah, it's not in terms of gaining a following or having any follow-up. And part of it, to be fair, is because Bruce Galloway, who was the main force behind it, passed away while they were actually in the talks about doing a second volume, which was going to cover the ancient world and everything from like ancient Samaria and Egypt up to Alexander the Great, really,
Right.
and the fall of Rome. And fascinatingly, some of those notes did survive, which was really, kind of mind blowing, because when I started researching this, there was only a few people who were involved in it were even still alive or could be found. Bruce Galloway, died back like in 86 or 84. Bruce Query died in the early 2000s before I got the idea to try to track anybody down. Mike Hodson Smith, who was also a contributor, died sometime in the 1990s. Paul Sturman, I actually was around when I was doing the research, but I never tracked him down. I only found out he had died like in 2018. So unfortunately, I missed him, but I did get in touch with his daughter. But then my main points of contact were Nick Lowe, who was one of the co-authors, and Kevin Pryor, who is one of the people who is acknowledged, and then also a couple other people from the acknowledgements, like Andy Strangeways. So part of the really interesting thing about the story is that, Bruce Galloway, very into gaming, Bruce Quarry, very into gaming. One of them, but Nick Lowe was not really a gamer at all when he got roped into the project. He was a classics major. They all knew each other from a science fiction and fantasy club at Cambridge University. He was able to answer a lot of, some questions about the personalities. He couldn't tell me much about, the development of the rules or anything like that. And likewise, Kevin Pryor was not really as into the gaming aspect, but he did run some of the games with Bruce Galloway that are meant, and especially the Lee Cliffs scenario that was mentioned in the book. So I got a little more background on that. And despite the the claims of Fantasy Wargaming to try to create this really authentic medieval world, it sounds like Lee Cliffs was really just gonzo fantasy. I mean, it ended with like kind of an apocalyptic battle of like these werewolves attacking a town. And he worked in all these crazy things. Like there was a statue to Snow White in the dwarven quarter of the town that none of the players realized was Snow White. They just kept walking by the statue of a fair maiden, I guess. And he had all these little in jokes. As serious and stolid as Galloway makes himself sound, it sounds like he was really, pretty gonzo as well. He just wanted to try something different. And I think probably the most overlooked thing about the book is that he was trying to show people that they could create their own role-playing game, that they didn't have to, play anybody else's game. They could do some research and, either develop their own world or, use something from the real world.
So Lee Cliffs was a fantasy game, but that was not. There's also sort of a murder mystery LARP that happened at the same time.
Yeah. So the follow-up was called. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue. It's something like Talum Marn or
it sounds like
Talum,
like something you would name a standing stone.
Yeah, but so that was apparently it used some of the same rules, but it was set during World War II or just before World War II, and it was more of a LARP. Everybody was like kind of gathered in some country house and were given different roles, mostly of like pulp figures from the 1930s. Like there was one character who was basically Charlie Chan, another character who was, another British literary character I can't think of, but that was it was a World War II spy kind of plot. And that one also ended with the bad guys winning because there was like a Nazi spy who was building a bomb and he sets it off at the end. Nobody caught him. Yeah, it was very much a LARP. The people who were involved in it mentioned that they had an old time Victrola playing period music during the game and things like that.
I think the thing that strikes me about hearing a lot of this stuff and kind of it's all sort of implied in the book, but never really directly addressed, but this really does feel like the product of like a group of school friends. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was very common, especially in like the English wargaming culture at the time, for people to develop their own rules. Like every wargaming club had their own war games rules that were, kind of homebrewed. And it's
Seems
just
like
the same
so
thing
much
with
work.
these guys. Yeah, yeah, it does.
So you said you played this.
Yeah. So, yeah, my brother and I tested it out a fair amount when we first got it, just rolling up characters and playing out some fights. And I ran a couple of sessions. I can't say that they were great. It was back when I was in high school and I was not, an experienced game master or anything. And so I basically had everybody make characters and ran them through Beowulf.
Oh, okay.
They were all
Well, that's
gathered at a
cool.
hall, and then they were attacked by a monster, and yeah. So it was okay. They weren't clamoring to play again afterwards, but it was
But it's
it's
playable.
playable. Yes,
I,
yes.
and I'm kind of surprised by that because having read the book, I was really struck by how I didn't have any idea how to run it.
I think there would be maybe too much record keeping if you tried to implement all of the piety rules, and keeping track of, oh, did you go to church this Sunday, and which venial sins and mortal sins did you commit, and all that. At the same time, I think there's a couple elements of the game that are just, I think we're pretty brilliant as far as making it feel like authentic to the Middle Ages in a way most other games never really bothered to try or tried successfully. I think the social class system and the idea of piety, were both really, really pretty brilliant, because nothing is more important in the Middle Ages than your standing in society and your standing with God. And most role-playing games completely, even something like Chivalry and Sorcery or the more recent stuff like Lion and Dragon, kind of gloss over all that. And partly it's people aren't comfortable with putting the church into a role-playing game after the
True.
Satanic Panic, and partly I think it's hard for Americans especially probably to understand how hierarchical and stratified society was, and what social class would have meant.
Do you think that fantasy wargaming had a real material impact on games like Chivalry and Sorcery, or something like a Harn that really grasps for medieval realism?
Well, I mean, certainly they were all kind of inspired by the same desire to be real, to have the medieval realism. Definitely Ars Magica was inspired partly by fantasy wargaming.
Another complex, semi-unplayable game.
Yeah. It's hard to tell exactly what, to what extent other games were inspired by what they did versus the rules. They came out so virulently against Dungeons and Dragons and the idea of a dungeon crawl and things like that. They might have been a little bit behind the times. Maybe people had already been making those criticisms, but that was the first time I had seen it, and somebody talking so much trash about D&D and the tropes of D&D when I was back then. So I think there was some influence there, and I've always kind of wondered about the development of GURPS versus fantasy wargaming, because there were a lot of reenactors involved in fantasy wargaming, and Steve Jackson was actually a reenactor, in Scott as well. And I think they came upon a lot of similar ideas for combat. Actually the combat system in fantasy wargaming, it's a little wonky, but it was probably the first game I saw that had like a universal system where there's basically one chart that was reused over and over, for your combat results, for your disarming traps, for all these different situations, even like saving throws and magic. You would have a bunch of factors, you'd roll a percentile against it, and it would give you either a failure, partial success, complete success, and so on. These different levels of success, which I think RuneQuest did too to some extent, and that developed around the same time. So a lot of these might have just been ideas that were hit upon independently, but they also arose around the same time. So
yeah, that resistance table idea kind of was like from like 79 to like 84. I feel like like everybody wanted that one table that they could resolve everything on. So why did you decide to make this sort of your focus? Like, what was it about the fantasy wargaming that like inspired you to write a whole book about it?
Well, it was a few things. One was just I really had lots of good memories about the book, and about the game from when I was younger. I ended up doing a ton of research into Norse mythology and trying to stat out all the magic items and monsters and stuff into fantasy wargaming terms when I was like in 8th grade or something. But then also I started seeing a lot of discussion of fantasy wargaming in different, especially in internet forums, where people were just really dismissive and critical with not really, I thought, giving it a fair shake. Because it's pretty easy to take a couple of comments here and there out of context and say, oh, this is just this horrendous pile of foolishness, with it, and kind of miss things I thought were really pretty brilliant that they pulled off. So yeah, so it was partly as a corrective and maybe being a little contrarian, and partly just out of sheer love for the game. So, and what really I think threw me down the rabbit hole was I decided, why hadn't anybody talked to them? Because I'd seen, kind of in the old school, blogosphere, people talking to lots of, the old authors or people who knew them, and nobody had ever talked, most of the people involved were kind of mysteries. So in my day job as a librarian, I often have to track down authors to find out more information about them, to distinguish them, in our catalogs. So I thought, well, why don't I just try this with Bruce Galloway? And I started seeing all these different things written by someone named Bruce Galloway. I wasn't sure if they were all the same person. Like, there was works of history, there was works about the gay rights movement in England, there were works about political organizing, and so on, and also stuff about just taking hikes in different regions of England. And actually, they were all written by him.
Oh,
and so I was able to find out, that he had passed away because one of his history books mentioned his, untimely demise. So from there, I just became more and more interested to find out, more about this guy that had a pretty big impact in the sense that his book, became so widely known and maybe read and probably not played, but it was out there.
I mean, it's a very distinct book. I feel like it has secured a place in sort of at least the visual sort of language of early role-playing games. It's very distinct.
Well, yeah, and then the art in the book, it's just really amazing to me too. The guy that did the cover and a lot of the interior illustrations, Lawrence Heath, he really only did illustrations for that book and for some ads, and some advertisements in White Dwarf, and then he kind of stopped doing illustration at all. He was very into folk music and founded a magazine and went off in that direction. And I think now he wrote a science fiction novel pretty recently, but it's only available as an ebook, so I haven't actually read it yet. But he was a very nice guy. I'd be able to contact him by email, and he actually sent me the better scans of all of his, or at least of as many of the pieces he still had. But yeah, I wish he had stayed in gaming, or at least as an illustrator, because it's a real very very cool style.
Yeah, his art is absolutely fantastic and a lot more experimental and just sort of professional than a lot of what was coming out from other games. It's a really sharp looking book, I think, because of his art. I also think that it's just interesting that all these guys sort of blew away and disappeared. That sort of speaks to the nature of the project as like sort of truly hobbyist in a way that like game design has professionalized in the years since. And it's interesting to see what is essentially a group of friends, college pals, putting together this thing, getting US distro on a hardcover book, and then just sort of vanishing into time,
Yeah, they all kind of went off in their different ways. Nick Lowe became a professor, of classics. Bruce Quarry stayed in wargaming, but never, followed up. There were plans for a second volume, as I mentioned, and actually Bruce had gotten as far as making some outlines and assigning different parts to some of the original authors. But even in his plans, it was just going to be Bruce Galloway, Bruce Quarry, and Nick Lowe, because the other two had just kind of, had completely moved on. And it was just kind of sad to see in some of the letters that he had saved from that time that Bruce Quarry was kind of given a different position in publicity at Patrick Stevens, so he really couldn't keep up with it. And Nick Lowe, taking on the duties of a full-time professor, really couldn't keep up with it and wasn't really into gaming to begin with. He was kind of I think Bruce Galloway had this enthusiasm that would sweep people along with them because but that completely changed course too. And after he kind of gave up on the second volume, he went off into politics and other things.
It's a different time and place though, because if you look at the landscape of gaming culture now, everybody can get in on it. It's a very equal playing field, I think. I mean, granted, there's some very high level companies out there still, but it's not so much that, back then, it's like being in a band. You got one band, one album, one tour, and then you kind of go off in your separate ways because no one really sees the long game of staying in this business even tangentially, because it's all or nothing at that time in the world for a lot of things in entertainment, whether it's, writing books, whether it's being, an actor, whether it's being a musician. Like, you look at it from the standpoint of there not being any internet, there's no connectivity between the fans of a certain product, where you can kind of see that, like, oh, there are other people out there that may not be directly in front of me who would be really into this awesome thing that I did. So you're looking back, you're proud of this work, but like everyone's like, I gotta go get a day job, bro. Where now, like, you can have that day job and still write your books, have your cake, eat it too. So it's interesting. It's definitely interesting. It's a major bummer that they didn't get to do a second one, but I can understand why that would have been a massive hurdle at that point.
The game has like a sense of sadness about it, even just as it stands. There's just a sense of melancholy. I'm not sure that I knew any of the history of the game when I first picked it up, but like there's just like a heaviness. You could feel the history kind of coming off of it in like the little bits of like the Lee Cliffs and like this idea of a big group of people, and then knowing that it never really went anywhere. Interfacing with it in the 21st century, you kind of like you're already poised for this kind of like, oh man, this is sort of going to be a sad story.
So let's talk about something that's not sad. This book is out. You can get it. It's from ETC Press. The highest level of all, the story of fantasy wargaming. You can get it Barnes & Nobles in physical edition, Amazon. You can get it on Lulu, which I think is so cool that you can get it off of Lulu. And there is a PDF available. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and the PDF?
Sure thing. So the book, it's published through an academic publisher, which makes it kind of pricey, but we're also providing a free PDF, so everybody can at least read it, even if you don't get to own the don't get a copy. So it's very heavily illustrated too, which was kind of the first time ETC had tried something like this. So my illustrator, Heather Ford, was, well, I guess to back up, the idea for writing the book kind of came from a series of blog posts I'd been writing about fantasy wargaming. And then over time, they were just getting so out of date and incorrect. I wanted to update them and bring them more, a more accurate picture. And then I found out that my blog had been cited in an academic book, Gaming Reimagines the Middle Ages, something like that. Oh. And so I was talking to Tim Hutchins, who has published lots of games. He's an award-winning game designer. He did the 1,000-Year-Old Vampire and things like that. And he said, "Well, why don't you do a book and we'll publish it through my university." Well, then COVID happened, and their university press kind of went under. But he still hooked me up with a graphic designer when I told him I was finally done with the writing. So her name was Heather Ford. They had the idea to make it look more like a scrapbook than just a dry academic, manuscript, which I think worked out really well. So she did tons of original illustrations, and she also took some of my old papers and a bunch of papers that Nick Lowe provided us from their plans for the second volume. And so now it's like a full color, glossy, almost, I'd say it's a coffee table book, but it's more, the normal book size, like a novel.
A classy bookshelf book.
But it looks nice. Yeah. I'm really enjoying your really proud of it. So yeah.
I really love the fact, I love the design. I love the fact that it has that collection of papers feel. I love the fact that you reproduced, the handwritten text. It's rare to kind of see that kind of direct look at the archival material.
It definitely has a cool vibe to it. It definitely has a not stuffy, published by an academic company feel to it. It definitely has that. There's a lot of love put into this book, and a lot of like cool vibe to it. So, good on you for that. So this book is out now. You could pick it up in physical copy. You can get the PDF. We will have the link to the PDF in the notes and links to where you can actually buy physical copies because we love killing trees. So why not help with that endeavor? So with that being said, thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your time today with us and for coming on and talking about the highest level of all. We're always excited to chat with other authors about the really cool stuff that they're doing. And this is something that is definitely a labor of love, and it shows in the pages. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on your show. I've listened to it for quite a long time, so it's really exciting to be on.
This was another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG podcast. Stu, where can the people find you on the internets?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG. I have posted about Fantasy Wargaming a long time ago, and you could dig up our old episode if you want to learn more.
In the archives, but still available where you find your podcast. Michael, how about you? Where can people find you on the internet if they want to learn more about the book?
Well, I'm still running my old blog, Swords and Dorkery. So that's just
It's a good
WordPress. Name. Yeah, that's my WordPress blog. That's really the only gaming presence I have anymore.
We'll link to that in the notes.
Thanks.
And as for me, you can find me across the internet at John McGuire RPG on the Twitter, on the Instagram, on the TikTok for however much longer that exists. And while you're on the internet looking up my social media profile, as you know, 321 Action has a brand new Kickstarter coming out on April 18th. It is a holiday action double feature with Hard Times on the Back 9 and Kevin Saves Christmas. I know I announced this on April Fool's Day, which is my 44th birthday. However, I swear to God, we actually did write a miniature golf adventure. It's real. It's written. There's artwork that we paid people for. It is coming out April 18th. Launching on Kickstarter. Please smash that notify button, get notified of launch. I really did make a miniature golf adventure for 321 Action. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. And if you really like the show, why not become a patron? Patreon.com/vintagerpg. We got some cool stuff happening over there. We got a behind-the-scenes look at 321 Action. We got a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book, which is called...
Oh, geez. Monsters, Aliens, and Holes in the Ground, a guide to tabletop role-playing games from D&D to Mothership.
And we actually have been running games for our patrons at certain tiers, doing shout-outs at certain tiers for patrons projects. We've got early release episodes at some point on Friday, depending on when I upload the stuff. And it's pretty cool. We have a Discord community that we'd love for you to be a part of, patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.